Grant Calloway slid the folder across the table like he was swatting away a fly. "Sign it," he said, not even looking up. "Take the money and disappear." 34-year-old Rachel Whitmore, the woman he had spent 8 years ignoring, dismissing and finally destroying, picked up the pen without a single word. The entire room held its breath, and Grant smiled because he believed silence meant surrender. He had no idea that in exactly 3 minutes, everything he thought he owned would be taken from him. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The conference room on the 14th floor of Northbridge Aerospace Systems had glass walls on 3 sides, and on a clear morning you could see the Cascade Mountains in the distance, pale and enormous, like something that had always been there and always would be. But nobody in that room was looking at the mountains that morning. Every single person seated around that long mahogany table was watching Rachel Whitmore. She sat alone on one side of the table. Across from her sat Grant Calloway, the company's chief operating officer, flanked by 2 attorneys in matching dark suits, a human resources director named Linda Forsyth, who had worked at Northbridge for 19 years and currently could not bring herself to make eye contact with anyone, and 3 department heads who had been summoned without being told why. The separation agreement sat in front of Rachel like a verdict that had already been handed down. 11 pages, single-spaced. The kind of document that took a team of lawyers at least 2 days to prepare, which meant Grant had been planning this moment for a while, which meant this was not impulsive. This was deliberate. This was a man who had decided carefully and methodically that Rachel Whitmore needed to disappear from Northbridge Aerospace Systems before she could do any more damage to his carefully constructed world. Rachel read every single page. Not quickly the way someone reads when they've already decided what they're going to do. Slowly, deliberately, the way someone reads when they want every person in the room to understand that they are not afraid, that they are not rushed, that whatever pressure is being applied is not working. Grant shifted in his chair. He was not a man who tolerated being made to wait. "Rachel." His voice carried the particular tone of someone who believes patience is a gift they are generously offering. "We've been here 20 minutes. The document is straightforward." 11 pages is not straightforward, Rachel said without looking up. One of the attorneys cleared his throat. Grant leaned forward. "You're being offered 6 months' salary, full benefits through December, and a clean exit. That is more than generous given the circumstances." Rachel turned to page 7. "Given what circumstances?" she asked. The room got very quiet. Grant's jaw tightened. "You filed a compliance report that accused senior leadership of financial misconduct without sufficient documentation. You created a hostile environment among the procurement team. You communicated directly with external suppliers in ways that exceeded your authority." Rachel finally looked up. "I communicated with suppliers about contracts I was managing." "You shared internal pricing benchmarks with a vendor." "I shared benchmarks with a vendor I was negotiating with, which is the definition of negotiation." "Rachel, which page does it say I exceeded my authority?" Another attorney. The younger one quietly pointed to a highlighted section on page 4. Rachel read it, nodded slowly, turned back to page 7. Grant's fingers pressed flat against the table. Linda Forsyth pretended to study something on her notepad. The 3 department heads, Dennis Huang from Engineering, Patricia Voss from Quality Assurance, and Marcus Webb from Finance, all sat with the particular stillness of people who deeply wished they were somewhere else. Marcus had his arms crossed. Patricia kept recapping and uncapping her pen. Dennis stared at a point somewhere above Rachel's left shoulder. None of them had spoken a word since the meeting began. None of them had defended her. This mattered to Rachel. Not because she expected loyalty from people who were afraid of their own positions, but because she had learned over 8 years to read silence, the same way other people read facial expressions. Dennis's silence meant he was ashamed, but not brave enough to act on it. Patricia's silence meant she had already decided survival required compliance. Marcus's silence meant he had known this was coming and had already made a private calculation. She stored all of that information quietly. She kept reading. Grant tried again, and this time he dropped the professional courtesy entirely the way a man does when he has decided that being reasonable is no longer in his interest. You've spent 8 years at this company acting like you're more important than your title, Rachel. Acting like your opinions carry more weight than the people above you. Acting like your little compliance reports and your supplier audits and your quiet notes in the margins of quarterly reviews actually change anything. He let that land. You are a senior procurement analyst. You manage contracts. That is the entirety of your role here. And you have spent nearly a decade making everyone around you uncomfortable by pretending it's something else. Rachel finished page 11. She closed the folder. She picked up the black pen that had been provided for her. She signed her name on the signature line. Smooth, calm, final. Grant leaned back in his chair, and the relief that moved across his face was visible and immediate. The expression of a man who has been holding tension in his shoulders for weeks and has just felt it release all at once. Good, he said. Linda will walk you through the offboarding process. You can collect your belongings this afternoon. Rachel set the pen down on the folder. Then she checked her watch. 10:17 a.m. Perfect, she said quietly. Grant frowned. It was a small frown, the kind that comes from noticing something slightly off without being able to identify what it is. Perfect. Rachel looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile, but contained all the ingredients of one. You'll understand in about 3 minutes. Nobody in the room laughed. Nobody asked what she meant. The question hung in the air like something that had been released rather than said. Grant's frown deepened. What does that mean? It means, Rachel said, folding her hands on the table in front of her, that you should probably stay in your seat. That was the moment. Right there. Even Grant felt it, though he would never have admitted it. Something shifted in the room, some invisible weight redistributing itself, and for one brief, unguarded second, the most powerful man in that conference room looked at the woman he had just fired and felt something that he would spend the next several weeks refusing to call what it actually was. Fear. He didn't understand it, so he buried it. I don't know what you think is about to happen, he said, but this meeting is over. Rachel didn't move. Grant, she said, and her voice was so calm it was almost gentle. I've worked in this building for 8 years. I've eaten lunch with the maintenance crews. I've spent afternoons in the fabrication shop learning how the machines actually work. I've sat in supplier meetings for parts that cost $12 and parts that cost $12 million. I've read every compliance report, every internal memo, every renegotiated contract. I've watched this company from the inside out, from the floor up, from the paperwork to the product. She paused. I know exactly what Northbridge is. I know what it was supposed to be. And I know what certain people have been quietly turning it into. Grant's expression had gone very flat. Is that a threat? No, Rachel said. It's a statement of fact. Then her phone buzzed once on the table. She glanced at it without picking it up. She looked back at the door, and 30 seconds later, the door opened. Nobody had buzzed them in. Nobody had knocked. The door simply opened the way doors open when the people coming through them do not need permission from the people already in the room. 3 individuals entered. The first was a woman in her early 40s in a charcoal blazer carrying a leather portfolio. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been in hundreds of conference rooms and found none of them particularly impressive. The second was a man in his mid-50s with reading glasses pushed up onto his forehead and a messenger bag that looked completely out of place against his obviously expensive suit. The third was an older man, 64, though he carried his age the way certain people do, as though it were simply information rather than limitation. Tall, white hair neatly kept, a face that suggested he had spent decades being the most important person in every room he entered without needing to announce it. Grant stared at him, and something happened in Grant Calloway's face that Rachel had been waiting 8 years to witness. Recognition, then confusion, then the first terrible edge of understanding. That's one of the attorneys started. Jonathan Whitmore, the other attorney finished, and his voice had gone completely flat with shock. Grant turned to Rachel so slowly it looked almost involuntary. She met his eyes. Whitmore, he said. My last name, Rachel said, has been Whitmore for 34 years, Grant. The silence that followed was the loudest silence Rachel Whitmore had ever sat inside. Grant's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. You're related to him. Jonathan Whitmore set his portfolio on the table with the unhurried precision of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. She's my daughter, he said. Grant Calloway did something in that moment that Rachel had not expected. He laughed. It was a short, disbelieving sound, the laugh of a man whose brain has received information it cannot process through any rational channel and is therefore routing it through the only other available option. Denial. He shook his head. That's not, you can't be serious. Jonathan opened his portfolio. Mr. Calloway, he said, with the particular politeness of someone who has no need for anger because the facts are already doing the work. Anger would otherwise perform. I'm going to need you to read this document before you finish that sentence. He slid it across the table. Grant didn't reach for it immediately. He was still looking at Rachel, and in his eyes was something complicated, something assembling and reassembling itself as new information kept arriving to dismantle what he thought he knew. Why? He said. And for the first time in 8 years, the word coming from Grant Calloway's mouth was not the controlled strategic question of a man managing his position. It was a raw, genuine question, the kind people ask when they genuinely do not understand. Why would someone like you, why would you spend 8 years reading contracts, Rachel said quietly, managing suppliers, eating lunch with the maintenance crew, because executives see the numbers, Grant. Procurement sees where the numbers come from. She glanced at the document her father had placed on the table. You might want to read that. The woman in the charcoal blazer, who Rachel would later introduce simply as Catherine, cleared her throat. Mr. Calloway, I represent Whitmore Capital Group. Over the past 6 weeks, we have completed the acquisition of shares from Northbridge's 3 largest institutional investors, in addition to several smaller stakeholders. As of this morning, Whitmore Capital controls 78% of Northbridge Aerospace Systems. Patricia Voss's pen fell off the table. Nobody picked it up. Marcus Webb uncrossed his arms very slowly, as though even that small movement might draw attention. Dennis Huang, who had been staring above Rachel's left shoulder for the entire meeting, finally looked directly at her. His expression was unreadable, but his hands flat on the table in front of him had gone pale. Grant had still not touched the document. This is not possible, he said. We completed the final transaction at 9:45 this morning, Catherine said. The board, Thomas Bennett. There were conversations with 3 private equity firms. Those conversations, Jonathan Whitmore said, were conducted in parallel with ours. The board believed they were negotiating with Meridian Capital. Meridian, in fact, withdrew from discussions 11 days ago. We did not make that withdrawal public. Grant finally reached for the document. He opened it, and Rachel watched the color leave his face, one realization at a time, as methodically and completely as water draining from a tank. 78%. Not a minority stake. Not a silent partner arrangement. Not a temporary bridge investment from a fund that would flip the company in 3 years. 78%. Controlling ownership. The kind of number that doesn't ask for a seat at the table because it already owns the table and every chair around it. You planned this, Grant said. He looked at Rachel. You planned all of this. The compliance report. The documentation. You were building a case for acquisition. Rachel shook her head. I built a case because the company was being harmed, she said. I submitted that case through proper compliance channels 8 months ago. I was ignored. I submitted a second, more detailed report 4 months ago. I was told to focus on my lane. She paused. My family's decision to acquire Northbridge had nothing to do with what happened to me in this room today. That process began 11 months ago when Whitmore Capital identified Northbridge as a structurally sound company being mismanaged toward failure. Then why were you here? Grant demanded. If your family was already acquiring the company, why spend 8 years in procurement? Why stay? Because I was learning, Rachel said simply. Learning what? She looked at him with an expression that was not unkind, which somehow made it worse. Who everyone was when they thought I had nothing. Grant set the document down. And Rachel knew, watching him in that moment, that this was the thing he would never recover from. Not the financial investigation that was coming, not the regulatory inquiry that would follow, not even the end of his career at Northbridge. The thing Grant Calloway would carry forward from this morning was the memory of every conversation he had ever dismissed, every report he had ever ignored, every meeting where he had looked at Rachel Whitmore and seen nothing worth paying attention to. He had been performing for an audience of 1, and that audience had been watching everything. Jonathan Whitmore turned to address the room, and his voice, when he spoke, was the voice of someone stating logistics rather than exercising power, which is perhaps the most effective way to exercise power there is. Northbridge's existing board and operational leadership will remain in place through the transition period. No immediate personnel changes are being announced today. However, beginning this week, Whitmore Capital's appointed advisors will conduct a comprehensive independent audit of all supplier contracts' executive expenses, quality control documentation, and compliance records for the previous 5 years. He did not look at Grant when he said it. He didn't have to. Linda Forsythe, who had managed human resources at Northbridge for 19 years and had sat in more difficult meetings than she could count, pressed both hands flat on the table, stared at the legal pad in front of her, and did not move. Marcus Webb, whose financial department would be at the center of the audit, had gone the color of old paper. Patricia Voss from Quality Assurance was gripping her pen so hard her knuckles were white. Dennis Huang had not moved or spoken. Rachel stood. She gathered the separation agreement. The document she had just signed. Grant had spent 2 days preparing the document that was supposed to end her, remove her, and make her disappear from a company that her family now controlled, and she slid it back across the table. Grant looked down at it, then up at her. "What happens to this?" he asked, and his voice had lost every instrument of authority it had ever contained. He sounded for the first time in Rachel's experience of him like someone who was simply asking a question. Rachel picked up her bag. "That's up to the new controlling shareholders," she said. She walked to the door. She put her hand on it. And then she paused because there was one more thing. Not a threat, not a performance, just the truth stated as simply as she knew how. She looked back at the room, at Grant, at the attorneys, at Linda, who finally looked up and met her eyes with an expression that contained something that might have been relief, at Dennis, whose shame had finally found its way to the surface of his face, at Patricia, who had uncapped her pen so many times it was beginning to leak, at Marcus, who was already calculating. 8 years ago, Rachel said, I was hired into this company as a junior analyst. My first week, I asked a vice president for a meeting to discuss a supplier discrepancy I'd noticed in onboarding documentation. He told me to forward my concerns to my direct manager and not to waste senior leadership's time. She paused. I never forgot that. Not because it hurt my feelings, but because what he was really saying was that the information I had wasn't valuable because of where it came from. She opened the door. Information doesn't care where it comes from, she said. Truth doesn't care who holds it, and companies don't care who signs the checks, not when the decisions being made with that money put people in danger. The door closed behind her. For a long moment, nobody in the conference room spoke. Then Grant Calloway picked up the separation agreement, looked at it, and set it back down. Jonathan Whitmore closed his portfolio. Catherine produced a second document from her bag and slid it to the center of the table. This is the formal audit engagement letter, she said. We'll need signatures from authorized Northbridge representatives before end of business today. Marcus Webb looked at it. Then he looked at the door Rachel had walked through. And for a reason he wouldn't be able to explain clearly later, he picked up his pen and signed it first. Not because he was told to, not because he had calculated that cooperation was his best strategic option, but because something in what Rachel Whitmore had just said had landed in a place inside him that strategy didn't reach. Outside the conference room, Rachel walked to the elevator. The door opened. She stepped in. And in the 12 seconds it took the elevator to descend to the lobby, Rachel Whitmore, for the first time since she had entered that building 8 years ago, leaned back against the wall, closed her eyes, and let out a breath that had been waiting inside her for longer than she could measure. She had not won today because her family bought a company. She had won today because she had spent 8 years becoming someone who knew exactly what she was doing and exactly why, and that kind of winning, the kind rooted in preparation and patience, and the willingness to see clearly when everything around you was designed to make you feel small. That kind of winning could not be taken away by a separation agreement, or by any other piece of paper anyone had ever tried to put in front of her. The elevator reached the lobby. Rachel walked out of the building. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The work that mattered was just beginning, and she already knew where to start. Back on the 14th floor in the conference room with glass walls on 3 sides and the Cascade Mountains pale and enormous in the distance, Grant Calloway was still sitting where she had left him, the signed separation agreement on the table in front of him, staring at a door that had already closed. And outside that door, all 78% of a company's future was walking toward the parking garage, keys in her hand, heading somewhere the people in that room had never thought to look, because they had never thought to look at her at all. And that was the first mistake. It would not, as it turned out, be the last. But this one, the very first one made on a morning in Seattle, when a man slid a folder across a table and thought he had just solved his problem, this mistake, quiet and ordinary and invisible at the time, would prove to be the one that unraveled everything. Every decision that followed, every cover that had to be lifted, every name that would appear in an audit report, every document that had been archived when it was supposed to disappear, it all led back to this moment. A conference room, a signed document, a woman checking her watch, 3 minutes. That was all it took. 3 minutes to discover that the person you spent 8 years underestimating had been for every single one of those 8 years the most consequential person in the building. And she was just getting started. The elevator doors opened on the lobby level, and Rachel walked out into the main atrium of Northbridge Aerospace Systems without looking back. Not because she was indifferent to what was happening on the 14th floor, but because she already knew exactly what was happening up there, and she had known for weeks, and knowing things in advance has a way of removing the drama from the moment itself. The drama for Rachel had already happened. It had happened in quiet offices, in late-night phone calls, in documents she had read and reread, until every number was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. She sat down in a chair near the lobby windows. She placed her bag on her lap. She folded her hands on top of it, and she waited. 10:18 a.m. She had 2 minutes left. On the 14th floor, Grant Calloway had not moved from his chair. The separation agreement sat on the table in front of him, signed and closed, and the 3 department heads were still frozen in their seats, and the 2 attorneys were exchanging glances with each other that said very clearly that they were both reconsidering the speed with which they had accepted this particular engagement. Linda Forsythe had pressed her notepad flat against the table as though she were trying to hold the table down. Nobody was speaking. The room had the particular quality of air that has been breathed by too many anxious people for too long. Grant finally pushed back from the table. "Whatever that was," he said, addressing the room at large with the voice of a man who has decided that confidence is the only tool remaining to him. "It doesn't change anything. The separation is executed. She's done. We move forward." Dennis Huang said nothing. Patricia Voss recapped her pen. Marcus Webb looked at the document in front of him. Grant straightened his jacket. "Marcus, I need the Q3 supplier review on my desk by Thursday. Dennis, the prototype testing schedule needs to be reconfirmed with the production team before end of week. Linda processed the offboarding by..." His phone rang. It was Thomas Bennett, the CEO of Northbridge Aerospace Systems, a man who called Grant perhaps 3 times a year because Grant managed his own floor with enough autonomy that Bennett rarely needed to intervene. 3 calls a year. This was not one of those scheduled moments. Grant answered. "Thomas." "Get up here," Bennett said. "Now. I'm in the middle of..." "Grant." Bennett's voice had something in it that Grant had never heard before, something thin and stretched the way a person's voice gets when they have just received information that has not finished landing yet. "Get up here right now." 10:20 a.m. Down in the lobby, Rachel's phone buzzed once. She looked at the screen, read the message, set the phone back in her bag. She stood up. She walked back to the elevator. And she pressed the button for the 16th floor, which was the executive suite, which was where Thomas Bennett's office was, which was where she knew everything was about to happen in public for the first time. The elevator was fast. It had always been fast. One of the things Rachel had noticed in 8 years of riding this elevator was that it moved faster going up than coming down, which she had always assumed was a quirk of the building's mechanical system, but which on this particular morning felt like something else entirely. Thomas Bennett's assistant, a young man named Paul, who had been in the role for 7 months and had never seen anything like what was about to happen, was standing outside the executive conference room with the expression of someone who has just been told that the rules he was given during orientation do not apply to this situation. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, and then stopped because he had not been told to expect her, and also because her badge had been confiscated 40 minutes ago, and also because there were already people inside the conference room whom he had not been introduced to, and the whole morning had the feeling of a building where multiple different earthquakes were happening simultaneously on different floors. "It's all right, Paul," Rachel said. "I know the way." She pushed open the door. Thomas Bennett was standing at the head of the table. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, and had built a reputation over 2 decades as a steady, careful, competent executive. He was not a man who rattled easily, but he was rattled now. visibly, the kind of rattled that comes not from fear, but from genuine disorientation, from receiving information that has no frame to hang on, because nothing in your previous experience prepared you for it. Jonathan Whitmore was already seated at the table. Catherine, the M&A attorney, sat to his left. The investment banker, whose name was Robert Eller, sat to his right, a thick acquisition binder open in front of him. Grant Calloway came through the door 30 seconds behind Rachel, still buttoning his jacket, and when he saw the configuration of the room, he stopped moving so suddenly that one of the attorneys from downstairs who had followed him walked directly into his back. Nobody laughed. Under different circumstances, someone might have. Bennett turned to Rachel. "Would someone please tell me what is happening in my company?" It was the phrase "my company" that fell on the room with the particular weight of something that is technically accurate in one sense and completely incorrect in every other sense, and everyone in the room understood this simultaneously, and the understanding produced a silence that was almost physical. Jonathan Whitmore spoke first. "Mr. Bennett," he said, "I appreciate your directness and I intend to match it. My firm, Whitmore Capital Group, has over the past 6 weeks acquired controlling interest in Northbridge Aerospace Systems from its 3 largest institutional shareholders and 4 smaller stakeholders. As of 9:45 this morning, we hold 78% of outstanding shares. I recognize this is abrupt. I want to be very clear that our intentions for Northbridge are long-term and operational, not extractive. We're here to rebuild, not to liquidate." Bennett sat down slowly. "Who authorized? How did the board not?" "The transactions were conducted through intermediary entities in compliance with all applicable securities regulations," Robert Eller said, producing a secondary document from the binder. "Your board was not required to be notified until the threshold was crossed, which occurred this morning." "This morning," Bennett repeated, "at 9:45. Bennett looked at Rachel. "Ms. Whitmore," he said, and he said her name with a new awareness. The awareness of a man who is realizing that a word he has used dozens of times suddenly carries a meaning it didn't carry before. I wasn't aware that you were." "I know," Rachel said simply. "That was deliberate." "Deliberate," Grant said from across the room, and his voice had found a new register, something harder and hotter than the controlled professional tone he had deployed downstairs. "It was deliberate. That's what you're saying. You spent 8 years inside this company, inside my operational chain, reporting to people I trusted, accessing documents, supplier data, financial records. I worked in procurement," Rachel said. "I accessed procurement documents. Nothing I saw or used was outside my authorized access." "You were a spy." The word hit the room like something thrown. Jonathan Whitmore turned toward Grant with an expression that had gone very still and very flat, the expression of a man who has tolerated the acceptable edge of rudeness and is now watching it step over the line. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "my daughter worked at this company because she wanted to understand how industrial operations actually function at the operational level. That is something she has done at 2 other companies before Northbridge in both cases, without any connection to our firm's investment activities. She is not an agent. She is not a spy. She is an exceptionally capable professional who chose deliberately and independently to build her knowledge from the ground up rather than from the top down. Whether you find that admirable or threatening says considerably more about you than it does about her." The room was very quiet. Grant's jaw worked. He was calculating. Rachel could see it in his eyes, the rapid triage of a man assessing his position, and she knew exactly what he was calculating, because she had known Grant Calloway for 8 years, and she understood the architecture of how he thought. He was deciding which story protected him best. He was deciding whether contrition or aggression gave him more runway. He was deciding most fundamentally whether there was still a version of this morning that ended with his position intact. There wasn't, but he hadn't accepted that yet. "Thomas," Grant said, pivoting deliberately away from Jonathan and toward the CEO, "I need you to hear me out before this goes any further. Rachel Whitmore submitted a compliance report 8 months ago accusing multiple members of senior leadership of financial misconduct. That report was reviewed and found to be substantially unsubstantiated. She submitted a second report 4 months ago. That report was also reviewed. The concerns she raised were legitimate in some areas and overstated in others. What she has done, whether deliberately or not, is use her position to feed a narrative that serves her family's acquisition strategy. That is a conflict of interest. That is grounds for—" "For what?" Rachel said. Grant stopped. For what, Grant? She said again. For termination. She tilted her head slightly. You already did that. 40 minutes ago, on the 14th floor. I signed the agreement. You have the document. She paused. Or is it not about me anymore? Thomas Bennett pressed both hands against the table. He was a man who had survived 2 recessions, one near bankruptcy, and a product liability suit that had occupied 4 years of his life. He had dealt with difficult situations, but this was a different category of difficult, and he was honest enough to recognize it. What happens now? He asked. He was asking Jonathan, but he was looking at Rachel. Jonathan nodded to Catherine, who produced a third document from her portfolio and slid it to the center of the table. Whitmore Capital will appoint 2 independent board observers, effective immediately, Catherine said. They will have no voting rights during the transition period, but will have full access to financial records, operational documentation, and executive communications. Simultaneously, we are engaging an independent forensic accounting firm to conduct a comprehensive audit of all supplier contracts, expense authorizations, and quality control documentation for the preceding 5 years. Marcus Webb, who had followed the group up from the 14th floor and was standing near the door with his arms folded, went very still. 5 years, he said. Every contract, Catherine confirmed. Every expense authorization, Robert Eller added. Every quality control report, Rachel said. She was not looking at Marcus when she said it. She was looking at Grant. But Marcus heard it, and the sound it made when it landed in him was visible in the sudden slight shift of his weight from one foot to the other. Grant's strategy recalibrated in real time. Rachel could almost watch it happen. The aggression drained, the contrition was tested and discarded. What remained was the third option, the one that certain kinds of powerful men always arrive at eventually when the first 2 fail. He would cooperate, publicly and visibly. He would position himself as the person helping to identify problems rather than the person responsible for them. He would distance himself from the suppliers, the contracts, the falsified reports. He would find someone below him to absorb what was coming. Rachel knew this because she had watched him do exactly this twice before in her 8 years at Northbridge. A quality audit in 2019, a supplier dispute in 2021. Both times Grant had managed to transfer the consequence downward while keeping his own hands clean. Both times the people below him had taken the damage, and Grant had remained untouched. She had documented both instances. She had documented a great many things. I want to be helpful to this process, Grant said to Jonathan, and his voice had changed completely, every instrument of authority gone replaced by something smooth and collaborative and utterly false. Whatever concerns existed around the supplier relationships, I want to be part of resolving them. I've always prioritized this company's integrity. Jonathan looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, That's good to hear, Mr. Calloway. The forensic team will be in touch. And something in the way, Jonathan said it without warmth, without hostility, with nothing but the clean, flat certainty of a man who already knows what the forensic team is going to find, made Grant go quiet in a way that the aggression had not. Thomas Bennett picked up the audit engagement document. He read it. He set it down. He looked at Rachel, and in his eyes was something that was not exactly guilt, but was related to it. The expression of someone who is recognizing too late the cost of decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. Rachel, he said, I should tell you that the compliance reports you submitted, the second one particularly, I read it. Not the summary, the actual report. I read it over a weekend in February, and I spent the following week asking questions and getting answers that satisfied me at the time. He stopped. I think I was asking the questions to the wrong people. Rachel looked at him. You were, she said, but her voice was not unkind. And I think you knew that on some level. I think a lot of people in this building knew things on some level and decided that the level they knew them on didn't require action. She paused. That's what audits are for. Bennett nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Cooperation, Rachel said. Full and immediate. No document holds, no communications delays, no one being quietly advised to adjust their records before the forensic team arrives. She let that sit in the room for exactly 1 second, which means the people who need to hear that instruction need to hear it in the next 20 minutes before anyone has time to make calls. Bennett turned to his assistant, who had materialized in the doorway. Paul, I need a mandatory all hands with every department head in the main conference room. 20 minutes. Nobody leaves the building until they've received a direct communication from legal about document preservation. Paul disappeared. Grant had not moved from his position near the window. He was looking at Rachel with an expression that had gone completely neutral. The expression of a man who has run out of moves and is now simply occupying space while he waits to see what happens next. But beneath the neutral surface, Rachel could see something working, some residual calculation, some last remaining instinct that had not yet accepted that the board was empty. She turned away from him. Because watching Grant Calloway run out of moves was not something she had spent 8 years working toward. It was simply an outcome, a necessary one, but not the point. The point was $31 million. The point was a defective component that was currently sitting in a parts inventory scheduled for installation in a prototype aircraft within 48 hours. That part she did not mention yet, because the audit needed to be independent. Because if she led the investigation toward the conclusion, rather than letting the forensic team arrive at it through their own documented process, Grant's attorneys would use that to contaminate the findings. She had thought about this carefully. She had thought about almost every contingency carefully over many months, sitting alone at a desk in a small house in the suburbs of Seattle, reading documents that had been provided to her through legally authorized compliance procedures, building a picture of something that was much bigger and much more dangerous than a COO skimming contracts. But she had to let the audit find it. She had to be patient for a little while longer. Not long. 48 hours was not long. Unless you knew what was scheduled to happen inside those 48 hours. Rachel excused herself from the executive conference room and walked down the hall to a small office that had been arranged for her use during the transition period. It was a plain room with a desk and a window and a chair, and she sat in the chair and called a number she had saved in her phone for 6 months without using it. It rang twice. "Marcus," she said when he answered, "I know you're still in the building. I need you to sit down somewhere quiet for the next 30 minutes and think very carefully about what your signature appears on, and then I need you to think about what cooperation looks like versus what non-cooperation looks like from the perspective of a forensic accounting firm with full document access." She paused. "And then I need you to call me back." She hung up. She waited. Her phone rang in 11 minutes. Marcus Webb's voice on the other end was different from the voice she had heard in the conference room downstairs. The confidence was gone. What replaced it was something that Rachel recognized not from Marcus specifically, but from a certain category of person who has spent years making decisions that were not quite ethical and not quite illegal, and has successfully avoided ever having to account for the difference. That person's voice, when the accounting finally arrives, has a particular quality. Stripped. Functional. The voice of someone trying to figure out which truth serves them best. "How much do you know?" Marcus asked. "Enough," Rachel said. "The question is what you know." A long silence. "The Kellerman contracts," Marcus said. "The invoicing structure, the way the approvals were routed." "Yes." "Grant set it up," Marcus said. "I flagged the routing in 2021. He told me it had been reviewed by outside counsel and was compliant." "Did you ask to see the outside counsel opinion?" Another silence. Longer. "No," Marcus said. "Why not?" "Because Grant was—" He stopped. Started again. "Because the margins on those contracts made the quarterly numbers work, and the quarterly numbers were what the board was looking at, and I had a team of 18 people, and I needed those numbers to work." Rachel listened. "So you looked the other way," she said. "I didn't actively—" "Marcus," her voice was steady, "the forensic team is going to be here tomorrow. They're going to look at every approval you signed, every routing decision, every quarterly report, not the summaries, the underlying documents." She paused. "You can spend tonight deciding what story protects you, or you can spend tonight putting together everything you know in the order in which you learned it, with documentation, and hand it to the forensic team voluntarily at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." She let that sit. One of those options has a different trajectory than the other. Marcus was quiet for a very long time. "The Kellerman Group," he said finally, "is partially owned through a holding company. The holding company has 2 principals. One of them is Grant's college roommate." Rachel already knew this, but she let Marcus tell her, because sometimes the most important thing about information is not the moment you receive it. It's the moment someone else decides to give it to you voluntarily. That moment is different. That moment is the beginning of something. "Write it down," she said. "Everything. Tonight. Tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock." She hung up. She sat in the quiet office and looked at the wall and thought about the component. The flight control component. The one scheduled for installation in 48 hours. The one whose engineering report had been reclassified as compliant in a revised document that bore the original date but contained different findings than the original version that Rachel had preserved as a legally authorized compliance copy 8 months ago. 2 reports. Same date, different conclusions. One of them was in a filing system. One of them was in Rachel's bag. And somewhere in the production facility on the 3rd floor of this building, the component those 2 reports disagreed about was waiting in an inventory bin to be installed in an aircraft that people were planning to test. Rachel picked up her bag. She stood. And she walked toward the stairs because she had spent 48 hours thinking about whether to trust the audit process to find this in time. And she had decided that patience had a limit, and that limit was a component capable of producing a catastrophic control failure under extreme vibration being installed in a prototype aircraft. Some things you document, some things you stop. She was done waiting on this particular one. The stairwell door closed behind her, and Rachel Whitmore walked down 11 flights of stairs toward a factory floor where something dangerous was sitting in a bin that nobody yet knew to look at. And she thought about what she was going to say when she got there, and how she was going to say it, and what would happen afterward. She had signed a document that morning designed to erase her. And now she was walking back into the building that document was supposed to remove her from carrying a piece of paper that could stop something irreversible from happening, because it turned out that silence and disappearance were 2 completely different things. She had been silent for 8 years. She had never disappeared. And she wasn't starting now. The production floor at Northbridge Aerospace Systems was a different world from the 14th floor. Down here, nobody wore blazers. Nobody carried leather portfolios. The language was technical and direct, and the people who spoke it had spent years earning the right to speak it, and they knew the difference between a specification that was met and a specification that had been written to look like it was met. Rachel had always felt more comfortable down here than in any conference room she had ever sat in. It was 11:14 a.m. She had exactly 34 hours before the prototype testing was scheduled to begin. The production floor supervisor was a man named Carl Briggs, 53 years old, 21 years at Northbridge, the kind of person who knew every machine on the floor by the sound it made when something was slightly off, who could walk past a workstation and know within 30 seconds whether the technician running it had slept enough the night before. Carl had worked under 4 different production managers, survived 2 restructurings, and had once personally halted a full assembly run because a torque specification on a fastener looked wrong to him. He had been right. The fastener was wrong. The production manager at the time had been furious. The structural engineer who reviewed his findings had quietly shaken Carl's hand a week later and said nothing more about it. Rachel knew all of this because she had eaten lunch with Carl Briggs at least 40 times in 8 years. Carl looked up when she came through the door from the stairwell. He looked at her badge clip, which was empty, and then at her face, and then at the bag over her shoulder. "I heard something was happening upstairs," he said. "Something is happening everywhere today," Rachel said. "Carl, I need to ask you about the flight control component for the prototype, the Kellerman-sourced unit. Where is it right now?" Carl's expression changed in a way that was subtle, but not invisible. The kind of change that happens in a person's face when they hear a question they have been quietly hoping someone would ask. "Bay 7, he said. "Cleared for installation tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. pre-check, then installation starting at 9. Has anyone from QA signed the final clearance?" Forsyth's team ran the revised inspection report through 2 weeks ago. Everything came back compliant. "The revised report," Rachel said. Carl looked at her steadily. "Yeah, the revised one. There was an earlier version, from about 8 months ago. I saw it when it came through the first time. I asked Patricia Voss about the discrepancy between the 2 versions, and she told me the first one had contained measurement errors that were corrected in the revision. Did that explanation satisfy you?" Carl was quiet for 2 full seconds. "No," he said. "Why not?" "Because the first version flagged a resonance issue in the actuator housing under high vibration conditions," Carl said. And the revised version didn't mention that finding at all. Not to say it was wrong, not to say it had been retested, just gone, like it was never there. He crossed his arms. In 21 years, I have never seen a finding disappear from a revised report without an explanation of why it was removed. Rachel opened her bag. She pulled out a folder. Inside the folder was a document that was 9 pages long, printed on paper, that had a Compliance Archive timestamp in the upper right corner. She placed it on the workbench between them. Carl looked at it. Then he looked at her. "Is that the original?" he said. "It's a legally authorized compliance copy I preserved 8 months ago," Rachel said, "before the revision was filed." Carl picked it up and read it the way a man reads something he already knows is going to confirm what he feared. Slowly, carefully, page by page. When he got to page 6, he stopped, read it again, set the document down on the workbench. "Resonance frequency range of 4.2 to 6.8 kilohertz," he said quietly. "Actuator housing shows microfracture propagation risk under sustained vibration in that range." He looked up. "This aircraft hits that range during the test profile, specifically during the high-angle maneuver sequence in the second phase of testing." The words landed in the space between them with the particular weight of information that cannot be taken back once it has been understood. "How confident are you in that assessment?" Rachel asked. "Completely," Carl said, without hesitation. "Then I need to talk to the chief engineer." "Daniel Marsh," Carl said. "He's in the second-floor engineering suite. He's been here since 6 this morning. He's always here early on prototype prep days." Carl was already moving, already picking up his radio, already operating with the decisiveness of a man who has been waiting for someone to walk through a door and say exactly what Rachel had just said. "I'll take you up." They were moving within 30 seconds. 11:22 a.m. The engineering suite on the second floor was quieter than the production floor, but carried its own kind of intensity, the concentrated, pressurized focus of people solving problems that had physical consequences. Daniel Marsh was 58 years old, chief engineer for 11 years, and had the reputation of being the most difficult person in the building to argue with, because he never argued from emotion and never backed away from a position simply because a more powerful person was pushing against it. He had clashed with Grant Calloway on 4 separate occasions in the past 3 years. He had lost all 4 clashes in terms of organizational outcome. He had been right on all 4 technical questions. Rachel knew this too. She knew a great many things about a great many people in this building. Carl knocked twice on the open door and walked in without waiting. Daniel looked up from his workstation. "Carl." Then he saw Rachel. Something moved through his expression. Recognition, then something more complicated. He had seen the all-hands notification on his computer 15 minutes earlier. He knew something significant was happening at the executive level. He did not yet know what. "Ms. Whitmore, I've been getting messages about Daniel," Rachel said, setting the folder on his desk. "I need you to read page 6 of this document before we talk about anything else." He looked at the folder, looked at her, picked it up. He read page 6. Then he read page 5, then page 7. Then he went back to page 6. When he set it down, his face had the expression of someone who has just heard a sound they recognize as the specific sound of something going wrong and has understood in the same moment what it means and what it will cost and what needs to happen in the next 30 seconds. "Where did this come from?" he said. "It's the original engineering assessment on the Kellerman flight control component," Rachel said. "The version that was filed 8 months ago before a revised version replaced it in the system." "I was shown the revised version," Daniel said slowly. 2 weeks ago, when I asked to see the supporting documentation for the QA clearance. What did you think of the revised version?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "I thought it was clean, professionally done. I didn't have the original to compare it against, so I had no way to know what had been removed." He looked at the document in front of him. "This finding on page 6. This is exactly the kind of failure mode I would flag on a test profile like tomorrow's. The high-angle maneuver sequence takes the airframe into sustained vibration in the 4 to 6 kilohertz range for approximately 90 seconds. What happens to the actuator housing during those 90 seconds? Carl asked. Daniel picked up a pencil, set it down. If the microfracture propagation is real, and this report suggests the initial testing indicated it was then sustained vibration in that range could accelerate fracture growth to failure point. control surface response becomes unpredictable. At altitude and speed, unpredictable control response is, he stopped. It's catastrophic. That's what it is. The words sat in the room like something that had arrived uninvited and intended to stay. Rachel looked at Daniel. I need you to halt the testing, she said. It was not a request, but it was not delivered as an order. It was delivered as the only logical conclusion of everything that had just been placed in front of him, stated by someone who trusted him to draw the correct conclusion and act on it, which is a different kind of power than the kind that issues commands. Daniel was already reaching for his phone. I'm pulling the component from Bay 7, he said, and I'm calling the test team lead right now. He was dialing before he finished the sentence. Paul, it's Marsh. Stop everything on the prototype prep. I mean everything. Right now. Yes, I don't care. Stop it. I'm coming down. He hung up, stood, picked up the original engineering report. Can I keep this? He said. It's yours, Rachel said. There are additional copies in secure storage. He nodded. Then he stopped. And for a moment Daniel Marsh, who was not a man given to visible emotion, looked at Rachel Whitmore with an expression that had something raw at its edges. This report was filed 8 months ago, he said. Yes. And it was replaced with a revised version. Yes. And nobody who could stop tomorrow's test saw the original version. Not until now. Daniel was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Someone made a decision, he said slowly, to remove a safety finding from an engineering report, and that decision was made by someone who understood what the finding meant, which means they made it knowing what the consequence could be. Yes, Rachel said. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were clear and decided. Then this is not about corporate politics, he said. This is a safety matter, and I'm treating it as one. He walked out of the engineering suite with the original report under his arm, moving with the controlled urgency of a person who has fully processed a crisis and is now entirely focused on what needs to happen in the next 10 minutes. Carl followed. Rachel walked behind them both, and as they moved through the hallway toward the stairwell, she was aware of how quiet the building felt. The particular quiet of a place where something enormous is happening on multiple floors simultaneously, and the people moving through the hallways don't yet know all the pieces, but can feel the pressure of them. 11:38 a.m. They reached the production floor in 4 minutes. The component was in Bay 7, exactly where Carl had said. It was mounted in a handling fixture cleared and labeled with a green QA sticker on its housing that someone had placed there 2 weeks ago, based on a report that didn't contain the finding that mattered most. Daniel Marsh looked at it for 1 second. Pull it, he said. 2 technicians began the removal procedure immediately. That was the moment Grant Calloway walked onto the production floor. He had heard the all-hands notification. He had heard that Daniel Marsh had called the test team. He had calculated in the 20 minutes since leaving the executive conference room that the testing halt was the most dangerous thing that could happen to him, because a testing halt would require explanation, and explanation would require documentation, and documentation was the one thing Grant had been managing very carefully for 8 months. He walked in with the particular controlled intensity of a man who believes he can still redirect what is happening. Daniel, he said, what's going on down here? Daniel turned around. Grant saw the document in his hand, and in the half-second before his expression locked down, something crossed his face that Rachel, standing 6 feet away, identified with absolute precision. Recognition. He knew what the document was, not from the cover or the formatting, from the way Daniel was holding it, from the fact that it existed at all on the production floor in Daniel Marsh's hand on the morning before a scheduled test. He knew. There's been a concern raised about the Kellerman component, Daniel said. I'm reviewing the original engineering assessment. We're pulling the unit from Bay 7 pending a full examination. The component cleared QA 2 weeks ago, Grant said. I'm aware of what the revised report says. Then why? Because I now have the original report, Daniel said. The one from 8 months ago, the one with the resonance finding on page 6. Grant's eyes moved to Rachel. She met them. Where did you get that? Grant said. His voice was steady. Impressively steady, Rachel thought, even now. I preserved a compliance copy 8 months ago through authorized channels, Rachel said, when I submitted the initial compliance report. That report was reviewed and the report was reclassified, Rachel said. The findings were not retested. The original engineering assessment was replaced in the system with a revised version that omitted the primary safety concern. The person who authorized that revision knew what the concern was because they commissioned the original assessment. The floor had gone quiet. The technicians working the removal procedure were still working professional enough to keep moving, but the ambient noise of the floor had dropped. People nearby were aware that something was happening that was different from ordinary production conversation. Grant took a step forward. "You are manufacturing a crisis," he said, and his voice had found a new edge, something harder and more desperate than anything Rachel had heard from him all morning. "You are using your family's position to target me personally, to build a case to destroy everything I've built here, and you are doing it by taking an 8-month-old preliminary report and presenting it as though it represents an active safety threat when it has already been addressed through proper—" "Daniel," Rachel said quietly. Daniel held up the document. "Page 6, he said to Grant. "Resonance frequency range, actuator housing, microfracture propagation under sustained vibration." He looked at Grant with the flat technical precision of a man who has no room in his framework for anything except what the data says. "This finding was not retested. It was removed. If you can produce documentation showing that this specific finding was addressed through additional testing, I will review it immediately and we can make a decision together. If you cannot produce that documentation, the component stays out of the aircraft." Grant said nothing. The silence was its own documentation. "That's what I thought," Daniel said. He turned back to the technicians. Grant grabbed Rachel's arm, not hard enough to hurt, but firmly. The grab of a man who has run out of words and is reaching for something else, some physical assertion of presence, some last claim to control. Rachel looked down at his hand on her arm. Then she looked up at him. "Take your hand off my arm, Grant." Her voice was so quiet and so completely without anger that it was more alarming than anger would have been. He released her. Carl Briggs, who had been standing 4 feet away and had seen the whole thing, took one step forward. He didn't say anything. He just positioned himself with the quiet deliberateness of a man who has 21 years of understanding when a situation needs a body between two people. Grant stepped back. "This is not over," he said. "You're right," Rachel said. "It isn't. But that component isn't going in that aircraft." Grant turned and walked off the production floor. Rachel watched him go. Then she looked at Carl, who gave her a look that contained several things at once: relief and vindication, and the particular weariness of a person who has been right about something dangerous for a long time without anyone listening. "Thank you," she said. Carl shook his head. "Don't thank me. I've been watching that component for 2 weeks trying to figure out who to call. 12:04 p.m., the component was fully removed from Bay 7 by noon. Daniel Marsh took it to the materials testing lab himself and began the examination procedure with 2 of his senior engineers. Rachel stayed on the floor for 20 minutes and then went back upstairs because there were other things moving simultaneously and she needed to track them. The forensic accounting team had arrived. 3 people from an independent firm called Meridian Forensic Group, which had no connection to the private equity fund of the same name and which had been retained by Whitmore Capital 3 weeks earlier in anticipation of exactly this moment. They were set up in a conference room on the 9th floor with direct access to Northbridge's financial servers, and they had already begun pulling the Kellerman contract files. Rachel stopped in the hallway outside the forensic team's room and looked through the glass panel in the door. The lead forensic accountant, a woman named Sandra Cho, was working through something on a large monitor with the focused, unhurried energy of someone who has done this many times and knows that the evidence is always there if you look in the right sequence. Rachel did not go in. She had made a decision weeks before today that she would not participate directly in the financial investigation, not because she lacked information, but because every piece of evidence that came out of this audit needed to be completely independent of Rachel Whitmore, traceable only to source documents and financial records, untouched by the daughter of the company's new controlling shareholder. The moment Rachel's fingerprints appeared on the audit findings, Grant's lawyers would argue influence. They would argue agenda. They would spend years arguing it in civil proceedings and administrative hearings, and they might not win, but the argument would be enough to cloud what the numbers said. The numbers needed to speak without her, so she stayed in the hallway. Her phone rang. Marcus Webb, she answered. I'm in the forensic team's waiting area, Marcus said. His voice had the quality of someone who has made a decision that frightened them, but which they understood was correct. I have everything. Printed. 3 years of routing approvals, the Kellerman contract authorizations, the Q3 and Q4 adjustments that made the supplier invoicing look compliant. I have emails. He paused. I have an email from Grant from March 2022 telling me specifically how to route the approval so it wouldn't trigger the standard review threshold. Rachel closed her eyes for half a second. Did you forward that email anywhere at the time? She asked. No. Does it still exist in the original server archives? I asked IT this morning, Marcus said. They pulled it. It's there. Then walk in there and hand everything to Sandra Cho, Rachel said. Tell her you're providing voluntary disclosure. Tell her you want to cooperate fully. Will that help me? He asked. Rachel was honest. I don't know what the legal consequences look like for you, Marcus. I'm not your attorney. But I know that voluntary cooperation looks different than being found at the end of a forensic investigation. That much I can tell you. A long pause. Okay, he said. He hung up. Rachel stood in the hallway for a moment. Outside a window at the end of the corridor, she could see the parking lot 6 floors below, and in the parking lot she could see Grant Calloway's silver car still parked in his reserved space, which meant he was still in the building, still working some angle, still believing somewhere in the architecture of who he was that there was a move remaining. She felt no satisfaction in this. She felt something closer to exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a person who has carried information for a long time, who has known what was coming for months, who has done everything correctly and carefully and patiently, and who now has to stand still and let the machinery she set in motion do the rest of its work. 1:47 p.m. The materials testing lab results came back at 1:45. Daniel Marsh called Rachel directly. The microfracture propagation is real, he said. And his voice had the particular flatness of a man delivering information he had hoped on some level would come back different. It's not theoretical. The fractures are already present in the housing. Under sustained vibration in the 4 to 6 kilohertz range, we are estimating failure probability at somewhere between 60 and 75%. Rachel sat down. 60 to 75%, she said. At minimum, possibly higher depending on exact vibration duration. He paused. If this had gone into that aircraft tomorrow, and if the test had proceeded through the full high-angle maneuver sequence, someone would have died, Rachel said. It was not a question. Yes, Daniel said. At minimum, the test pilot, depending on ground personnel proximity, potentially others. Rachel put her hand flat on the desk in front of her. She had known this was possible. She had known it intellectually from the numbers in the original report, from her understanding of the test profile, from 8 years of learning how this company worked from the inside out. But knowing something intellectually and hearing a chief engineer say the words 60 to 75% failure, probability are two different experiences. And for a moment, sitting in that small office on the 4th floor of Northbridge Aerospace Systems, Rachel Whitmore allowed herself to feel what it meant. Someone would have died because a report was revised, because a finding was removed, because a man needed the numbers to work. She pressed her hand harder against the desk. Then she picked up her phone and called Jonathan Whitmore. Her father answered on the first ring. Daniel Marsh just confirmed a manufacturing defect in the Kellerman component, she said. 60 to 75% failure probability under the test profile. The component has been pulled from Bay 7. Testing is halted. A silence on the other end of the line. Are you all right? Her father asked. Yes. Are you sure? I will be, she said. And she meant it. Not immediately, but she would be. We need to notify federal aviation regulators today, not tomorrow, today. Catherine is already drafting the voluntary disclosure, Jonathan said. I moved on it the moment Daniel's lab pulled the component. I anticipated the confirmation. Of course you did, Rachel said, and despite everything, despite the weight of the day and the exhaustion and the particular grief of understanding how close something catastrophic had come, she almost smiled, because her father was in the end exactly the person she had learned from, and that was not nothing. Rachel, Jonathan said. Yes. You did something important today. She was quiet for a moment. I just gave Daniel Marsh a piece of paper, she said. You gave him the right piece of paper at the right moment, Jonathan said. That is sometimes the entire difference. She hung up. 2:31 p.m. Grant Calloway was called into a meeting with Thomas Bennett and Northbridge's general counsel at 2:30. Rachel was not in the room. She was in the hallway outside a different office waiting for Sandra Cho to emerge from the forensic session with Marcus Webb, which had been ongoing for 70 minutes. What happened in the meeting with Bennett Rachel pieced together later from separate accounts. Grant had walked in, already talking, already moving through the argument. He had clearly spent the previous 2 hours constructing the argument in which he was a competent executive who had made decisions in good faith based on the information available to him, in which the Kellerman relationship was a business decision, not a conflict of interest, in which the revised engineering report had been processed through what he believed were proper channels, in which Rachel Whitmore's involvement was a targeted campaign of personal destruction enabled by her family's financial power. High made the argument well. It was a good argument constructed by a smart man who understood how these rooms worked and what language moved in them. The general counsel listened to all of it. Then she placed 2 documents on the table. The first was Marcus Webb's voluntary disclosure printed and time-stamped containing the March 2022 email in which Grant had provided specific instructions for routing the approval to avoid the standard review threshold. The second was Daniel Marsh's materials testing report with the failure probability assessment circled in red. Grant looked at both documents. "I want to call my attorney," he said. "That's your right," the general counsel said. "Mr. Calloway, effective immediately, you are suspended with pay, pending the outcome of the independent forensic investigation and the regulatory review initiated by this morning's voluntary disclosure to federal aviation authorities. Your system's access will be suspended and your communications preserved. Do you understand?" Grant said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "This isn't justice. This is a woman with a powerful family destroying someone who got in her way." Thomas Bennett, who had been silent through most of the meeting, looked at Grant with an expression that Rachel would later describe when she heard about this moment as the expression of a man who is grieving something he helped build. Grant Bennett said, "If that component had gone into that aircraft tomorrow, and if someone had died, what would you have said then?" Grant didn't answer. He called his attorney. 3:15 p.m. Sandra Cho knocked on the door of Rachel's temporary office at 3:15. She sat down across from Rachel, opened her laptop, and said, $31 million, over 4 years, routed through 6 Kellerman invoices that were structured to appear as standard procurement transactions. The holding company connection to Calloway's associate is documented in the entity registration records. We also found 2 additional suppliers with similar structures, smaller amounts, but the same pattern. She looked at Rachel. "This is not a close call." "No," Rachel said. "It isn't." "How did you find it originally?" "I managed procurement," Rachel said. "I saw where the numbers came from." Sandra looked at her for a moment. "Do you want to be in the room when we brief Jonathan Whitmore?" she asked. Rachel shook her head. "Brief him directly. The findings need to stand on their own." Sandra nodded. "All right." She stood. Then she paused. "Ms. Whitmore, I've done 40-something of these audits. I want you to know that what you preserve, the original compliance copy of that document, is probably the single most important piece of evidence in this entire case. Without it, the revised report was clean enough that the defect might not have been identified until— "I know," Rachel said. Sandra nodded once and left. Rachel sat alone in the office for a long time after that. Outside the window, the afternoon had moved toward 4 o'clock, and the parking lot below was beginning to empty as the first wave of employees left for the day. They filed out through the main entrance, some talking, some on their phones, some walking in the particular silence of people who have spent a day inside a building where something enormous happened and are still trying to absorb the shape of it. Most of them didn't know everything yet. They knew an acquisition had occurred. They knew testing had been halted on the prototype. Some had heard that Grant Calloway had been suspended. The full picture of the component, the $31 million, the depth of what had been happening inside their company for 4 years, that picture would come together over the following days as the audit findings were compiled and the regulatory processes began. But they were going home, and tomorrow they would come back. And their company, broken and hollowed and dangerous as it had become, was not going to close, was not going to be stripped, was not going to be turned into something unrecognizable. It was going to be rebuilt. Rachel had not saved Northbridge Aerospace Systems this afternoon, but she had stopped it from losing something it could never recover from. That was enough for today. She picked up her bag, stood, looked out the window one more time at the parking lot below at the workers, going home at the building around her that had been her workplace and her classroom and her project for 8 years. She thought about the young technician named Marcus Reyes she had eaten lunch with during her first week at Northbridge, who had shown her how a hydraulic actuator worked and explained with genuine pride what it meant for a component to pass a real inspection versus a paperwork inspection. She thought about Carl Briggs, who had flagged a torque specification because something sounded wrong to him and had been right. She thought about Daniel Marsh, who had halted a test in progress because a piece of paper said there was a reason to. She thought about all the people in this building who had done their jobs honestly and carefully, who had raised concerns that disappeared, who had written reports that were revised, who had been managed and maneuvered, and slowly convinced that the safest thing to do was stay quiet. She was done letting that be true. The work was just beginning. She walked out of the office down the hall and toward the elevator, and Northbridge Aerospace Systems, all 78% of it, prepared for the longest night it had ever had, not knowing yet that the morning on the other side of that night would be the first real morning it had seen in a very long time. The morning after the longest day Northbridge Aerospace Systems had ever survived came in quietly the way mornings do when they follow nights that contain too much. Rachel had not slept more than 3 hours. She had been on calls until past midnight, first with Catherine about the regulatory disclosure timeline, then with Jonathan about the forensic audit scope, then with a Federal Aviation Authority contact who asked detailed questions about the component removal procedure and the chain of custody for the original engineering report. By the time she finally stopped, the city outside her apartment window had gone completely dark and completely still. She was at her desk by 6:15 the next morning, 7:02 a.m. The first thing waiting for her was a message from Daniel Marsh sent at 5:47 a.m., which meant he had also not slept much. The message said simply, "Secondary examination complete. Fracture propagation confirmed in second unit from same Kellerman production batch. Recommend full batch quarantine. Already initiated. Will have written report by 9. Rachel read it twice. Then she forwarded it to Catherine with one line added, "This needs to go to the regulatory team immediately. Full batch, not just the prototype unit." The second thing waiting for her was a message from Thomas Bennett sent at 6:30. It was longer. It took Bennett 4 paragraphs to say what could have been said in one sentence, which was that he was sorry, and that he understood now the full weight of what his failure to act on Rachel's compliance reports had nearly allowed to happen, and that he intended to cooperate with every aspect of the investigation and the transition. The fourth paragraph contained a sentence that Rachel read 3 times. It said, "I have been a competent manager of this company for many years, but I was not a courageous one, and I have spent the night understanding the difference." Rachel did not respond immediately. She set the message aside and thought about Thomas Bennett, who was not a bad man, who had built Northbridge into something genuinely impressive before Grant Calloway's influence had begun redirecting its momentum, and who had made the specific mistake that careful, competent people sometimes make, which is trusting the systems around them more than the evidence in front of them. She would respond to him later, carefully, because how she responded to Thomas Bennett in the next 48 hours would shape whether he became an asset to the transition or an obstacle to it. She already knew what she wanted from him. She just needed to figure out how to ask. 8:14 a.m. Jonathan Whitmore arrived at the Northbridge building at 8:14, accompanied by Catherine and 2 additional attorneys whose presence signaled that the day's conversations were going to be formal and consequential. Rachel met him in the lobby. Jonathan looked at his daughter in the particular way fathers look at their children after they have watched them do something that confirms everything they ever hoped they would become. It was a look Rachel had seen maybe a dozen times in her life and had never quite known how to receive. She deflected it now the same way she always did, by moving immediately to logistics. "The FAA contact wants a call at 10, she said. "The full batch quarantine report from Daniel will be ready by 9. Sandra's team worked through the night, and they have the complete $31 million finding documented across all 6 invoice structures. Marcus Webb's attorney called at 7 this morning to confirm continued cooperation." Jonathan nodded. "And Grant?" His attorney sent a letter at 6 a.m. requesting a meeting to discuss a negotiated resolution. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "Already?" "He moved fast," Rachel said, "which means his attorney has seen enough of the documentation to know that fighting it would be worse." "What do you want to do with the meeting request?" "Decline it," Rachel said. "Refer it to the forensic team's legal interface. Whatever resolution exists for Grant Calloway should come through the proper process, not through a conversation that his attorneys can later characterize as informal negotiation." Jonathan looked at her. "You're protecting the integrity of the process." "I'm protecting the company," Rachel said, "which is what we're here to do." They walked toward the elevator together. 9:33 a.m. The all-hands meeting that Thomas Bennett called for the full employee body was scheduled for 9:30 in the main auditorium, which was the largest space in the building and could hold approximately 400 people. By 9:25, every seat was full, and people were standing along the walls. Production workers in work clothes stood next to engineers in business casual. Administrative staff stood next to technicians. Everyone had heard pieces of the previous day's events. Nobody had heard all of it. The atmosphere in the room had the specific texture of a large group of people who are simultaneously frightened, hopeful, angry, and uncertain, which is perhaps the most difficult audience any leader ever has to address. Thomas Bennett walked to the front of the room. He was 61 years old and had given hundreds of presentations in this building, but he had never given one like this. Rachel watched from the side of the room and saw in his posture the weight of someone who has decided that honesty is the only available option, not because it is comfortable, but because everything comfortable has been removed. Bennett stood at the front and looked at the room for a long moment before he spoke. "Most of you know that yesterday was an unusual day," he began, and then he stopped and visibly reconsidered and started again. "No, let me be honest with you. Yesterday was the day that this company almost lost something it could never have recovered from, and I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, because you deserve to know, and because the only way forward from where we are requires everyone in this room to understand the truth of where we've been." The room was very quiet. Bennett spoke for 22 minutes. He covered the acquisition. He covered the forensic audit. He covered the Kellerman contracts in general terms without specific numbers, because the investigation was ongoing. He covered the flight control component. He covered the halt of testing. He did not use Grant Calloway's name because the investigation was ongoing and the attorneys had advised against it, but he said clearly that decisions had been made at a senior level that prioritized financial outcomes over safety standards, and that those decisions had consequences that the company was now addressing directly and fully. When he got to the component, the room shifted. A production technician named Alicia Reeves, who had worked on the prototype assembly team for 3 years, raised her hand. "Was someone going to die?" she asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands were pressed flat on her thighs. Bennett looked at her. The testing halt was made because the engineering assessment indicated a significant risk of component failure during the test profile. The full analysis is ongoing, but yes, the risk was serious. Alicia Reeves nodded once and said nothing more. The room processed that. Then a man from Quality Assurance, someone Rachel recognized as one of the younger inspectors named Kevin Tran, stood up without being called on. "I flagged a documentation inconsistency on that component 6 weeks ago," he said. "I sent a note to my supervisor. I never heard back." Bennett looked at him. "Kevin, I want you to know that note, and your name will be part of the investigation record. And I want to tell you directly in front of everyone in this room that the culture in which that kind of flag gets ignored is the culture we are ending today." Another silence. Then something happened that Rachel had not anticipated. Someone started clapping. Not enthusiastically, not celebratorily, slowly with the particular cadence of something genuine rather than perform the kind of applause that starts in one place because one person feels it and spreads because other people recognize the feeling. It moved through the room in about 15 seconds until most of the 400 people in the auditorium were part of it. Bennett stood at the front and did not take a bow. He simply nodded once and waited for it to settle. Rachel stood along the wall and watched, and felt something move through her that she didn't have a clean word for. It was not triumph. It was something quieter and more durable than triumph. It was the feeling of watching a large, complicated thing that had been tilting toward disaster slowly, incrementally begin to right itself. 10:47 a.m. After the all-hands, Rachel went directly to the call with the FAA contact, which lasted 40 minutes and covered the component batch quarantine, the chain of custody for the original engineering report, and the voluntary disclosure process. The FAA contacted a measured career official named Robert Delaney, who spoke with the careful precision of someone who has handled a great many corporate safety disclosures and understands exactly which ones are genuine and which ones are strategic. Ask detailed questions about the timeline of the original engineering assessment and the circumstances of its revision. Rachel answered everything, directly, without softening anything. At the end of the call, Delaney said, "Ms. Whitmore, in my experience with voluntary disclosures from aerospace companies, the ones that come forward before an incident occurs are genuinely rare. I want you to know that the speed and completeness of your disclosure will be on record." After the call ended, Rachel sat with her phone in her hand for a moment and thought about what Delaney had said. Before an incident occurs. 26 hours earlier, that component had been sitting in Bay 7 with a green QA sticker on its housing. If she had not walked down 11 flights of stairs with a folder in her bag, if she had decided that the audit process would find it, eventually, if she had waited 48 hours instead of acting in 30, the words voluntary disclosure would mean something entirely different right now. She put the phone down and went to find her father. 11:23 a.m. Jonathan Whitmore was in the executive conference room on the 16th floor, the same room where he had arrived 24 hours earlier, carrying an acquisition binder, now transformed into a working operation with laptops, documents, and 3 attorneys working through transition planning. When Rachel walked in, Jonathan closed his laptop. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I want to offer you the position of interim CEO of Northbridge Aerospace Systems," Jonathan said, "effective immediately, with the full support of Whitmore Capital and a transition mandate to stabilize the company through the next 18 months. Rachel had been expecting this. She had been expecting it since the previous afternoon when the component defect was confirmed and the financial fraud was documented, and the full picture of what she had spent 8 years building toward became visible. She had been expecting it the way you expect something when you have thought about it carefully and already know what you are going to say. "No," she said. Jonathan was quiet. "I mean that," Rachel said. "Not strategically, not as a negotiating position, no. Tell me why." Rachel leaned forward. "Because the story this company needs right now is not the story of a woman with a powerful family swooping in to take the top job after the bad guys were removed. That story feels satisfying from the outside, but from the inside, from the perspective of 400 people who just sat in an auditorium and heard their CEO tell them the culture of this company is changing. That story is just another version of power landing where power already is, a different face on the same structure." Jonathan looked at her for a long moment. "You've thought about this for a while," he said. "Since February," Rachel said. "When I read the second compliance report back to myself and realized that if everything I believed about what was happening here turned out to be true, this moment would eventually arrive. And I decided in February what I would do when it did." "And what did you decide?" Rachel told him. The name she had been carrying since February. The person she had watched for 8 years make the right calls in the wrong environment, being overruled and sidelined and gradually repositioned into irrelevance, because her version of doing things correctly was inconvenient for the version of Northbridge that Grant was building. The person who had spent 24 years at this company, understanding it from the engineering level, the safety level, the real operational level. Not from the boardroom, not from the executive floor, from the floors that mattered. Jonathan listened to the entire thing without interrupting. When Rachel finished, he said, "Does she know you're going to recommend her?" "Not yet," Rachel said. "I wanted to talk to you first." Jonathan picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking from it, looked out the window for a moment at the mountains pale and enormous in the distance. Then he looked back at his daughter. "You understand," he said carefully, "that there will be people who interpret this as a power play in the opposite direction, that you're turning down the position specifically to install someone loyal to you instead." "I know," Rachel said. "That's why my recommendation has to come with complete documentation of her record. Every overruled safety decision, every report she filed, every time she was right and was sidelined for being right. The recommendation can't be about who I trust. It has to be about who the evidence shows this company already trusted and got wrong for trusting and owes a correction to." Jonathan was quiet for a full 30 seconds. "All right," he said. "Set the meeting. 12:45 p.m. Dr. Allison Reed was 51 years old and had spent 24 years at Northbridge Aerospace Systems. She had a doctorate in aerospace engineering from MIT. She had led the structural analysis team through 2 major program completions in the early part of her career, had moved into senior engineering leadership, and had spent the last 4 years in what her official title described as a senior advisory role, which was the organizational equivalent of a room with no windows and a door that people rarely opened. She had been moved into that role in the summer of 2021 after refusing to approve a production schedule acceleration that Grant Calloway had ordered over her objection. Her objection had been technical. She had documented it in writing. Grant had overruled her, rewritten the schedule, and had her repositioned within the month. The acceleration had resulted in a parts failure 18 weeks later that cost the company $2 million in rework and was recorded in the internal incident report as a supplier quality issue. Allison had said nothing publicly. She had continued doing her job, which now involved reviewing documents that nobody urgent was waiting on and attending meetings that nobody essential was running. She had spent 4 years being quietly, methodically erased from a company she had given 2 decades to. When Rachel walked into her office, Allison looked up with the expression of someone who has learned not to expect much from unexpected visits. "Ms. Whitmore," she said. "Rachel, please," Rachel said. "Do you have 20 minutes?" Allison looked at her calendar. She did not look at it because she needed to check it. She looked at it because it gave her a moment to decide whether she wanted to have this conversation. "I have 20 minutes," she said. Rachel sat down. She placed a folder on Allison's desk. Inside was a printed record. 3 years of overruled technical objections, filed reports, documented decisions, and their documented outcomes. Allison's name appeared throughout, always on the side that had turned out to be correct. Allison looked at the folder without opening it. "I know what's in there," she said. "I know you do," Rachel said. "I put it together because I wanted you to see it as a document rather than as memory. Because memory is personal. Documents are organizational. And what this document shows is that Northbridge Aerospace Systems has been making wrong decisions in the exact areas where your judgment was available and ignored for 4 years." Allison was very still. "What are you offering me?" she said. And her voice was the voice of someone who has been disappointed enough times to require clarity before hope. "CEO," Rachel said. "Interim initially with a transition to permanent if you want it. Full operational authority. Independent of Whitmore Capital's day-to-day involvement. Your decisions, your team, your mandate." Allison looked at Rachel for a long time. "Why not you?" she said. "Your family owns the company. You clearly have the knowledge. You've been building toward this for years." "Because I've been here 8 years," Rachel said. "You've been here 24. You know things about this company that I spent 8 years trying to learn and still don't fully know. And you know them from the right place. Not from procurement, not from a compliance report, from the engineering reality of what this thing is supposed to do and how it's supposed to do it safely." Allison was quiet. "Also," Rachel said, "because the people on that production floor, the people in the engineering suite, the people who sat in that auditorium this morning, they know your name, they know your record, not because of a family connection, because of what you did and what you refused to do and what it cost you." She paused. "That's a different kind of authority than anything I could walk in here with." Allison opened the folder. She looked at the first page, turned to the second, stopped at a document dated August 2021, which was the written objection she had filed the week before the schedule acceleration that Grant had overruled. She looked at it for several seconds without speaking. "I cried when I wrote that," she said. Not to Rachel particularly, to the room, to the document, to the version of herself that had sat at a desk 4 years ago and understood exactly what was going to happen, and had written it down anyway because that was what she knew how to do. Not because I was afraid of losing my position, because I knew the schedule was going to cause a failure and I couldn't make anyone listen. Rachel said nothing. Sometimes the most important thing you can do in a conversation is let the other person be exactly where they are. After a moment, Allison closed the folder. "What's the mandate?" she said. "Remove corruption," Rachel said. "Preserve competence. Protect the people who did their jobs honestly and got buried for it." She paused. "And build something that doesn't need another 8 years of quiet observation to correct." Allison looked at her steadily. "And you," she said. "What's your role?" "Chief Transformation Officer," Rachel said. 2-year mandate. I'm not here to run the company. I'm here to make sure the systems that allowed this to happen cannot be rebuilt in a new configuration with different names on the doors." Allison was quiet for a full minute. The minute had weight in it. The weight of 24 years. The weight of decisions made correctly and overruled. The weight of a woman who had spent 4 years in a room with no windows, deciding every single day whether to leave or to stay, and staying every single day, because somewhere underneath the erasure, she still believed the company was worth staying for. "When do I start?" she said. "Monday," Rachel said. "If you want it." Allison nodded once. "I want it." 2:18 p.m. The announcement went out company-wide at 2:18 in the afternoon. Rachel had written the language herself and had it reviewed by 3 attorneys and Jonathan before it was released. It named Dr. Allison Reed as interim CEO effective the following Monday. It named Rachel Whitmore as Chief Transformation Officer. It described the forensic audit as ongoing and committed to full transparency with employees on its findings. It announced the immediate reinstatement of independent whistleblower protections that would operate outside the executive chain of command. And it announced that every employee who had been terminated in the previous 2 years under circumstances potentially related to safety or compliance concerns would have their case independently reviewed. The response began within minutes. Kevin Tran, the quality assurance inspector, who had stood up in the auditorium that morning, sent a message through the new reporting system that had been active for exactly 47 minutes. He had 6 additional documentation inconsistencies he had flagged internally over the past year and never received responses on. He wanted to know if he should submit them. Rachel responded personally, "Yes, all of them. Tonight if you can." Carl Briggs called her direct line at 2:34. "I have a list," he said. "Been keeping it for 18 months. 11 items. Things I flagged, things I saw, things I wrote up and watched get closed without action." He paused. "I didn't know who to send it to before." "Send it to the reporting system," Rachel said. "And Carl?" She stopped. "Thank you for this morning, for every time you flagged something in 18 months and kept flagging it even when nothing happened." Carl was quiet for a moment. "I got kids who work in aviation," he said. "So does everybody on my floor." That was all he said. It was everything. 3:52 p.m. Patricia Voss knocked on Rachel's office door at 3:52. She came in without waiting to be invited, which told Rachel something about how she was feeling, because Patricia Voss was not a woman who moved without permission. She sat down across from Rachel and put her hands in her lap and looked at the desk between them. "I knew," she said. Rachel waited. "Not everything. Not the Kellerman financial structure. Not the depth of it." Patricia's voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that takes effort. "But the revised report. I was shown the revised version, and I was told the original had contained measurement errors. I asked one question. I asked whether the resonance finding had been retested. I was told it had been addressed through additional supplier documentation." She looked up. "I didn't ask to see the supplier documentation." "Why not?" Rachel asked. Patricia pressed her lips together. "Because Grant was in the room when I asked the question, and I already knew what it would cost me to push further. I had watched what happened to Allison Reed. I had watched what happened to Dennis Huang when he questioned the schedule acceleration. I had watched what happened to you." She stopped. "I decided that asking one question was the most I could afford." Rachel looked at her. "Patricia," she said, "I'm not going to tell you that was the right call, because it wasn't. You know that. But I'm going to tell you that the environment that made that calculation feel rational is the thing we're here to change. Not just the people who exploited it, the environment itself." Patricia nodded slowly. "What happens to me? That depends on the forensic review," Rachel said honestly. "The QA sign-off on the component clearance has your department's stamp on it. The forensic team will determine what the liability picture looks like. I can't tell you what that means for your position. What I can tell you is that what you've told me right now, told me voluntarily today, matters. And it will be on record that you came in here and said it." Patricia stood. She was at the door when she turned back. "The analyst who flagged the original resonance finding," she said. "The one who wrote the page 6 assessment on the original report. Her name is Jennifer Choi. She's 28 years old, and she's been on temporary contract for 2 years because Grant didn't want her converted to permanent staff after she submitted that finding." She paused. "I think you should know that." Rachel wrote the name down. Patricia left. Rachel looked at the name for a long time. Jennifer Choi, 28 years old, temporary contract, who had written an engineering finding that was accurate, filed it through proper channels, watched it disappear from the official record, and had spent 8 months working in the same building as the people who had erased it, not knowing whether anyone would ever find it. Rachel picked up her phone. She called the HR transition team that had been assembled that morning and asked them to pull Jennifer Choi's contract file and put it on her desk by end of day. The call lasted 2 minutes. Then she sat back and thought about the chain of it. Jennifer Choi writes a finding. The finding gets erased. Rachel preserves a copy. 8 months pass. A component sits in Bay 7. Rachel walks down 11 flights of stairs. Daniel Marsh reads page 6. The component comes out of Bay 7. One document, moving from one person to another, each person making a decision about what to do with it. This was how things actually worked, not through corporate announcements and organizational charts and executive mandates, through individual people deciding at specific moments what to do with what they knew. Rachel had made her decision 8 months ago when she pressed print and put a document in a folder. Jennifer Choi had made her decision the day she wrote what the data actually said, instead of what was convenient. Carl Briggs had made his decision every time he added an item to a list that nobody was reading. These were the people who had actually saved Northbridge Aerospace Systems, not the acquisition, not the forensic audit, not the voluntary disclosure, the people who had kept being honest in an environment designed to make honesty expensive. 4:47 p.m. Grant Calloway's attorney sent a second letter at 4:47, requesting reconsideration of the meeting request. Rachel read it, forwarded it to Catherine, typed 3 words in the forwarding message. Same answer, no. Then she went back to the stack of documents on her desk and kept working. 5:30 p.m. Jonathan found her still at her desk at 5:30. He stood in the doorway and looked at his daughter surrounded by papers and open laptops and a coffee cup that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and his expression had the particular quality of a man who is simultaneously proud and concerned and wise enough to know that the moment calls for the first and not the second. "Go home," he said. "I have the Jennifer Choi file to review, and the supplier reinstatement framework needs to go to Allison before Monday, and the whistleblower protection language needs a second pass from Rachel." She stopped. "Go home," he said again. "The company will be here tomorrow." She looked at him. "Dad," she said, and she almost never called him that at work. In professional contexts, it was always Jonathan or nothing. But in this particular moment, at 5:30, in an office that smelled like cold coffee and audit documents, it came out naturally. "I spent 8 years being patient. I'm not sure I remember how to stop." Jonathan walked in and sat down across from her. "Patience and rest are different things," he said. "You were patient because the situation required it. You rest because the work requires it." He looked at the stack of documents. "Everything on that desk will still exist tomorrow morning, including Jennifer Choi's file." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "She's been on temporary contract for 2 years," Rachel said, "because she wrote an honest engineering finding." Jonathan nodded. "Convert her to permanent staff," he said. "Monday morning, first thing Allison does." Rachel looked at him. "I was going to recommend the same thing," she said. "I know," Jonathan said. "That's why I said it first." He stood. "Go home. Sleep. The company you spent 8 years trying to save is still standing. Let that be enough for tonight." She packed her bag. She turned off the desk lamp. She walked with her father to the elevator, and they rode down together in the particular companionable silence of 2 people who have spent a very long day doing something they believed in and have come out the other side of it together, which is one of the quieter forms of happiness available to human beings, unspectacular and durable, and not easily taken away. The lobby was mostly empty. The Northbridge building behind them was lit from within floors, still active, the forensic team working through the night on the 9th floor. Daniel Marsh's engineers completing the batch quarantine documentation, the new reporting system accumulating its first real inputs from people who had been waiting, some of them for years, for a place to put what they knew. The building was not the same building it had been 24 hours ago. It would not be the same building in another 24 hours. Change, real change, did not happen all at once in a conference room or an auditorium or an acquisition announcement. It happened in the accumulated weight of individual decisions made by individual people in individual moments, each one small on its own, each one part of something larger than itself. Rachel Whitmore had signed a document that morning designed to erase her. 24 hours later, she had converted an organization. Not by force, not by family, not by the accumulated power of 78% ownership. By doing over 8 years and one very long day exactly what she had always done, seeing clearly, documenting honestly, acting when action was the only option left, and trusting finally that the truth she had been carrying was strong enough to hold the weight of everything that came after it. She walked out into the night air. She got in her car. She drove home. And behind her, Northbridge Aerospace Systems kept its lights on because the work was not finished, and the work would not be finished for a long time, and that was all right. That was in fact exactly the point. The first Monday that Dr. Allison Reed walked into the CEO's office at Northbridge Aerospace Systems, she stood in the doorway for exactly 3 seconds before stepping inside. Not because she was hesitant, but because she wanted to feel the weight of the moment fully before it became ordinary. She had spent 24 years in this building. She had spent 4 of those years being systematically made to feel that her presence in any significant room was a problem to be managed. And now she was standing in the largest office on the 16th floor, with her name on the organizational chart at the very top, and she wanted to feel that completely before the day's first meeting consumed it. Rachel was already in the building when Allison arrived. She had been there since 6:45, which was earlier than almost anyone, but not earlier than Carl Briggs, who had sent her a message at 6:15 saying the production floor morning check was complete, and that he had 3 more items to add to his documented list that he had been unable to sleep without writing down. Rachel had responded, "Send them all. Everyone matters." 8:02 a.m. The first thing Allison Reed did as CEO at 8 o'clock on her first Monday morning was convert Jennifer Choi from temporary contract to permanent staff, effective immediately with a salary adjustment that reflected 2 years of work performed at a level that the temporary designation had been suppressing financially. The HR paperwork had been prepared Friday afternoon. Allison signed it before she signed anything else. The second thing she did was call a meeting of every quality assurance inspector in the building. Not management, not department heads, the inspectors themselves, the people whose job it was to stand in front of a component or a weld or a specification and say yes, this meets the standard, or no, it does not, and to have that judgment respected rather than overruled. There were 23 of them. They filled a mid-sized conference room on the 3rd floor. Most of them had never been in a room with a CEO before, and it showed in the way they sat carefully, with the particular alertness of people who have learned that attention from above usually precedes something unpleasant. Allison walked in and sat down at the table with them, rather than standing at the front, which was not what they expected. "I want to tell you something," she said. "And I want you to believe it, which I know is going to take time, because belief requires evidence, and I've only been in this chair for 2 hours. But I'm going to say it anyway, and then I'm going to spend however long it takes proving it." She looked around the table. "Your judgment is the most important technical resource in this company, not the engineering models, not the production schedules, not the quarterly numbers. The judgment of the person standing in front of a component, deciding whether it meets the standard. That judgment has been treated as an obstacle for years. It is not an obstacle, it is the point. And from today forward, any inspector in this room has the authority to halt a production process pending review without requiring management approval. That authority is yours. It cannot be revoked by anyone below me in this organization, and I will not revoke it." The room was very quiet. Then Kevin Tran, who was sitting 3 seats down from Allison, and who had stood up in an auditorium 4 days earlier and said publicly that he had flagged a documentation inconsistency and never heard back, said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," Allison said. "What happens if we halt something and we're wrong? What happens if we pull a component or stop a process and the review comes back clean and we cost the company time and money?" Allison looked at him directly. "Then you did your job. And I will defend that in any meeting at any level, including with our controlling shareholders." She paused. "The cost of a wrong halt is time and money. The cost of a missed defect is what almost happened last Thursday. I know which one I'm prepared to absorb." Kevin Tran nodded slowly. He looked like a person who had been given something he had stopped expecting to receive and was not quite sure yet what to do with it. 47 a.m. The forensic audit's preliminary findings were delivered to Jonathan Whitmore, Rachel Allison, and the company's general counsel at 9:47 that morning. Sandra Cho presented them with the same measured, unhurried clarity she brought to everything working through the documented structures, the routing mechanisms, the invoice patterns, the holding company connections, and the accumulated financial impact. $31 million over 4 years. 3 additional supplier relationships with smaller but structurally identical arrangements totaling approximately $4 million more. 14 internal documents that showed signs of revision without recorded authorization. 2 quality control reports besides the flight control component assessment that contained findings in the original version not present in the filed version. And 1 email, the March 2022 email from Grant Calloway, that Marcus Webb had preserved and surrendered voluntarily, that said in language that was specific and unambiguous and would prove to be the single most consequential piece of evidence in the entire case, exactly how the approval routing should be structured to avoid triggering standard review thresholds. When Sandra finished, the room was silent for a moment. Then Allison Reed said, "The 2 additional quality control reports. What were the findings that were removed?" Sandra pulled up 2 documents. One involved a structural weld specification on a component used in an earlier production program, now completed and delivered. The other involved a material certification on a part currently in service on 3 aircraft operated by a regional carrier. The room temperature changed. "Currently in service," Rachel said. "Yes," Sandra said. "On 3 operational aircraft." "Yes." Rachel looked at Allison. Allison was already looking at her. "We need to disclose that today," Allison said. "Not tomorrow, today." "Agreed," Jonathan said. "I'll call Delaney at the FAA," Rachel said. She was already reaching for her phone. The call happened within 20 minutes. Delaney's response was the same measured efficiency he had brought to the first call, asking precise questions, taking precise notes, and ending with the same observation he had made before, that the speed of the disclosure would be on record, and that in his experience, the companies that moved fastest on voluntary safety disclosures were the ones that had genuinely changed rather than the ones that were managing perception. Rachel thanked him, hung up, sat with her hands flat on the desk for a moment. 2 additional reports. 2 more findings that had been removed, one of them touching aircraft currently carrying passengers. She thought about Jennifer Choi, 28 years old, who had written what the data said on page 6 of an engineering assessment, whose finding had been erased, who had spent 8 months on a temporary contract in the same building as the people who erased it. She thought about what it meant that one person writing one honest document could 8 months later stand between a test pilot and a 60 to 75% probability of catastrophic failure. And then she thought about the 2 new reports, and about how many other honest documents were sitting somewhere in the archives of this company, correctly filed, accurately written, quietly revised out of the official record, waiting for someone to look in the right place at the right time. "Sandra," she said, "I want the full archive review expanded. Every engineering assessment, every QA report, every material certification for the past 6 years. Not a sample, everything." Sandra nodded. "That's a significant undertaking. We're looking at probably 3 additional months of work." "Then we start today," Rachel said. 11:15 a.m., 3 weeks passed. They were the most compressed, consequential 3 weeks Northbridge Aerospace Systems had experienced in its history. The FAA investigation into the 2 additional quality control reports moved quickly, aided by the company's complete documentary cooperation. The regional carrier voluntarily grounded the 3 affected aircraft, pending inspection, a decision that cost them operationally, but that their CEO, in a call with Allison Reed, described as the only acceptable option given the information. The inspections ultimately found no active defects on the in-service components, but the removed findings related to materials, certification tolerances, that under specific load conditions that had not yet been encountered in those aircraft's operational history could have produced accelerating wear. Could have, might have, under conditions that might never have occurred, or might have occurred on a Tuesday afternoon with a full passenger load. Nobody said that part out loud in any official communication, but everyone involved understood it. Grant Calloway's attorney stopped sending meeting request letters after the second FAA disclosure became public. The civil investigation had expanded to include federal wire fraud implications, and the conversation had moved entirely into a legal framework, where Grant's options were being negotiated not by his personality or his professional network, but by the documented evidence of what he had specifically directed in writing in a 2022 email, with full knowledge of the review thresholds he was circumventing. Marcus Webb reached a cooperation agreement with the investigating authorities in the second week. His attorney released a statement saying that Marcus had provided full voluntary cooperation from the first day of the investigation. Rachel read the statement and thought about the 11-minute phone call in the hallway, and Marcus's voice on the other end asking how much she knew, and the decision he had made to spend that night writing everything down rather than spending it constructing a story. That decision had cost him something. It had also, in all likelihood, saved him from something considerably worse. Dennis Huang from engineering submitted his resignation quietly on a Thursday afternoon in the third week. His resignation letter said nothing about the investigation. It said he was pursuing other opportunities. Rachel read it and thought about him sitting in the conference room on the 14th floor, not defending her, and also about the fact that in 3 years of working adjacent to Grant Calloway's decisions, Dennis had not signed his name to anything fraudulent. He had looked away, he had stayed silent, but he had not signed. That distinction mattered in a legal sense, though Rachel understood it mattered less in a moral one. She accepted his resignation without comment. Patricia Voss was a more complicated situation. The QA clearance on the flight control component bore her department's stamp, and the forensic review was examining the chain of authorization carefully. Patricia had retained her own attorney and was cooperating with investigators. The outcome of that process was not yet determined. Rachel did not intervene in it because she had meant what she said to Patricia on the day she came into the office voluntarily and said, "I knew." The process would determine the consequence. Rachel's job was to make sure the process was fair, not to make sure it was lenient. Linda Forsyth, the HR director, who had sat in the termination meeting on the 14th floor and been unable to make eye contact with anyone, came to Rachel's office in the second week with a document she had prepared on her own initiative. It was a complete record of every termination she had processed in the past 3 years that had involved an employee who had previously filed an internal safety or compliance concern. There were 11 of them. She had pulled the files, reconstructed the timeline for each case, and documented the proximity between the concern filing and the termination date. "I processed these," Linda said, sitting across from Rachel with the document between them. "I knew the proximity was troubling on at least 4 of them. I told myself the performance documentation was sufficient. I knew the performance documentation had been constructed after the concerns were filed in 3 of those cases." She looked directly at Rachel. "I should have done this 3 years ago." Rachel looked at the document. 11 people, some of whom had found other jobs, some of whom had not, some of whom had signed confidentiality agreements as part of their separation packages that had prevented them from discussing what they knew. "These confidentiality agreements," Rachel said, "the ones signed at termination." "I can get you all of them," Linda said. "Get me all of them today," Rachel said. "And then I need legal to review every single one, because if those agreements were used to suppress safety information from people who had a legal right to report it, the agreements are not enforceable, and the people who signed them need to know that." Linda nodded. She picked up the document, started to leave. "Linda," Rachel said. She turned. "You came in here on your own," Rachel said. "You didn't have to. The forensic team might have found this eventually, or might not have. But you came in and you brought the document and you told me what you knew." She paused. "That matters." Linda looked at her for a moment. "It's not enough," Linda said simply. "No," Rachel agreed, "but it's where you start." The twist that arrived in the 4th week was not from inside Northbridge. It came from outside, and it arrived in a way that nobody in the building had anticipated. A journalist named Patricia Okafor at a Seattle investigative outlet had been working a story about aerospace supplier networks for several months, completely independently of anything happening at Northbridge, and she had been tracking the Kellerman Group through a different angle, a former employee of one of Kellerman's manufacturing subsidiaries who had filed a whistleblower complaint with federal regulators 18 months earlier about quality control practices at that facility. That complaint had been filed, processed, and quietly filed away without action. The former Kellerman employee's name was David Morrow. He was 44 years old. He had worked as a quality engineer at the Kellerman subsidiary for 6 years and had documented in considerable detail the practices that produced the compromised components. He had filed his complaint 18 months ago and had heard nothing. He had then lost his job 4 months later officially for a performance reason and had signed a separation agreement. Patricia Okafor called Rachel's office on a Tuesday morning in the 4th week and said she was working on a story and wanted to give Northbridge an opportunity to respond. Rachel took the call herself. She listened to Patricia Okafor for 12 minutes without interrupting. The journalist was thorough and careful, and clearly in possession of information that connected directly to the Kellerman investigation in ways that the forensic team had not yet fully mapped. "Ms. Okafor," Rachel said when the journalist finished, "I'm going to give you something that I don't typically give journalists, which is a completely direct answer. Yes, the Kellerman component defect is real and documented. Yes, we halted testing. Yes, we have made voluntary disclosure to federal aviation authorities. Yes, the investigation is ongoing and we are cooperating fully." She paused. "And I want to tell you about David Morrow." Patricia Okafor was quiet for a moment. "You know about David Morrow?" "I do now," Rachel said. "And I want you to know that his whistleblower complaint, which was filed 18 months ago and received no meaningful action, is something that Northbridge is going to formally bring to the attention of the federal review process. We did not know about it before today. We know about it now, and we are not going to pretend we don't." Another silence. "Why are you telling me this?" Patricia Okafor said, with the specific caution of a journalist who has been given unexpectedly cooperative responses by corporate subjects and has learned to be suspicious of them. "Because David Morrow wrote down what he knew," Rachel said, "and filed it through proper channels, and nothing happened, and then he lost his job, and now he's been sitting on that for 18 months. She paused. "That is exactly the story this moment needs people to understand." Patricia Okafor's story ran the following Thursday. It was thorough, accurate, and contained a level of documentary detail that reflected both her reporting and Northbridge's cooperation. It was read by a significant number of people in the aerospace industry and by several people on Capitol Hill who were already engaged in oversight conversations about supplier certification processes in the aviation sector. David Morrow called Northbridge's newly established integrity line the morning after the story ran. He was put through to Rachel directly. She answered. "Mr. Morrow," she said, "thank you for calling." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think anyone was going to. I filed that complaint 18 months ago and nothing happened, and I thought—" He stopped, started again. "I thought I was the only person who knew." "You weren't," Rachel said. "And what you documented mattered. It's part of the record now. It's going to the regulatory review. It will be part of whatever accountability comes out of this." "I lost my job," he said. "I know," she said. "The separation agreement you signed is under legal review. We believe it may not be enforceable given the circumstances. Our attorneys will be reaching out to you this week." A long silence on the other end of the line. "I have a family," David Morrow said, and his voice when he said it was the voice of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just been offered for the first time the possibility that they might not have to carry it alone anymore. "I know," Rachel said. "I'm sorry it took this long." 6 months after the morning, Grant Calloway slammed a folder on a conference room table and told Rachel Whitmore to sign it and disappear. Northbridge Aerospace Systems looked fundamentally different from the inside. Production delays had dropped by 40%. Not because of a new management directive or a motivational initiative, but because the people doing the work had stopped spending energy on the parallel activity of managing around a system that didn't trust them. When you remove the weight of institutional dishonesty from a workforce, the work itself gets lighter. Rachel had not fully understood this intellectually before she watched it happen, though she had suspected it. Now she knew it as a fact. The safety reporting system had logged 214 separate reports in 6 months. 214 times someone at Northbridge had seen something or known something and decided to put it on record through a process they trusted would actually result in something. The previous year's internal safety reporting had logged 31, not because the building had been safer, because the reporting had been suppressed. Allison Reed ran the company with a directness that took some people time to adjust to because they were accustomed to a management style that operated through misdirection. Allison did not misdirect. She said what she thought, asked for what she needed, and defended the technical integrity of her decisions, with the particular confidence of someone who has spent 24 years being right and is no longer interested in performing uncertainty about it. The engineering team responded to her the way people respond to a leader who actually understands what they do, with something that looked like relief and functioned like engagement. Jennifer Choi was promoted to senior engineer 7 months in. The promotion was based on peer reviews, documented project contributions, and technical assessments conducted entirely without reference to the circumstances of her hiring conversion, because Allison had been clear that Jennifer's advancement would be earned on her own record, not gifted as correction for past injustice. Jennifer had not wanted a gift. She had wanted the chance. She got it. And she used it exactly the way someone uses a chance they have been waiting for without knowing quite how long. The Northbridge Integrity Initiative launched 8 months after the acquisition at an event held in the main auditorium where 400 employees had sat listening to Thomas Bennett on the morning everything changed. The initiative was an independently funded program providing legal, financial, and career assistance to employees at American manufacturing and technology companies who reported serious safety or financial misconduct and suffered retaliation as a result. It was not funded by Whitmore Capital. Rachel had been explicit about that in every conversation with her father during the planning process. The initiative needed to be structurally independent of the family's money to be credible. It was funded through a combination of aerospace industry partners, 2 nonprofit foundations with long histories in worker protection, and a federal grant that Rachel had spent 3 months pursuing through regulatory channels, which anyone who knew her would have recognized immediately as exactly the kind of patient, unglamorous, document-intensive work she had always done best. David Morrow was one of the first cases the initiative took on. The launch event was not a gala. It was a working event, and the people in the room were people who worked engineers and inspectors and technicians and compliance officers, and the occasional attorney who had spent a career doing the less visible parts of the legal system's work. Jonathan Whitmore sat in the 3rd row. Allison Reed sat beside him. Carl Briggs was there, which Rachel had specifically made sure of, because Carl Briggs had kept a list for 18 months and deserved to be in the room where what happened to people who kept lists was being formally addressed. Rachel spoke for 18 minutes. She did not speak about Grant Calloway. She did not speak about the acquisition or the fraud or the defective component or any of the specific events of the past 8 months, except obliquely as context for the thing she actually wanted to talk about, which was the 18 months David Morrow had spent knowing something important and having nowhere to put it, and the 8 months Jennifer Choi had spent watching her finding disappear, and the years Carl Briggs had spent adding items to a list that nobody read. She talked about what it costs a person to know something true and be unable to make it matter. She talked about what it does to a company when the people inside it stop believing that honesty has a protected path. She talked about what it takes to rebuild that belief, which is not a policy change or a corporate announcement or an executive mandate, but the accumulated weight of individual decisions made by individual people at individual moments, each one choosing to trust the system one more time and the system actually responding. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Jonathan Whitmore in the 3rd row started clapping. Not the performed applause of an audience following protocol, the genuine clapping of a man who has just watched his daughter say something he could not have said himself, because it required a kind of knowledge that could only be earned from the inside of something, and he had only ever observed it from the outside. The room joined him. Rachel stood at the front and received it, not with the discomfort of someone who finds attention difficult, but with the stillness of someone who understands that this particular moment is not about her. It is about what the moment represents, about Jennifer Choi writing what the data said, about Carl Briggs keeping a list, about David Morrow filing a complaint and waiting 18 months and calling an integrity line because a story ran in a newspaper and told him that someone was finally listening. After the event, Jonathan found Rachel by the window overlooking the factory floor. They stood together for a moment without speaking, watching the production floor below, the workers moving with the particular purposeful efficiency of people who know that what they are doing matters and that the judgment they bring to it will be respected. "Do you regret it?" Jonathan asked. 8 years of being invisible. Rachel considered the question seriously, the way she considered all questions. "No," she said, "because I wasn't invisible. I was present. Invisible is when nobody sees you because you don't matter. I was present and they chose not to look. She paused. That difference is everything. Jonathan was quiet. You knew things about this company, he said, that no due diligence process would have found. Because due diligence talks to executives, Rachel said. I ate lunch with Carl Briggs. Jonathan smiled. It was the smile of a man who is proud of something he cannot fully take credit for, which is perhaps the purest form of pride available to a parent. 1 year after Grant Calloway slammed a folder on a conference room table and demanded Rachel's signature, Grant himself was no longer a presence in the world Rachel occupied. His civil case was proceeding through a process that would take years and whose outcome was not yet determined. His professional network had contracted to almost nothing. Several people who had laughed beside him in conference rooms had stopped returning his calls, not out of moral conviction, Rachel suspected, but out of the self-protective instinct of people who understand that proximity to a certain kind of failure is itself a liability. He sent an email, not to her corporate address, to a personal address that almost nobody had, which meant he had made some effort to find it, which meant he had thought about sending it for a while before sending it. 4 words. I should have listened. Rachel read it once. She did not respond. Not because she was angry she had moved so far past anger that the territory was barely visible. Not because she wanted to withhold something from him, but because there was nothing to say. The truth he should have listened to had not belonged to her alone. It had belonged to Jennifer Choi and Carl Briggs and David Morrow and Kevin Tran and every person in that building who had written something honest and watched it get managed into silence. She could not respond on their behalf, and responding only on her own behalf felt insufficient to the weight of what the email was actually acknowledging. So she closed it and went back to work. The final scene in the story of Rachel Whitmore and Northbridge Aerospace Systems did not take place in a conference room or an auditorium or an executive office. It took place in a small meeting room on the 7th floor, which had been designated as the intake office for the Northbridge Integrity Initiative's internal case coordinator. The room had a desk and 2 chairs and a window and a box of tissues that had been placed there by someone who understood that people coming into this room for the first time sometimes needed them. A young woman named Sophie Garrett, 26 years old, sat across from Rachel. She had been at Northbridge for 14 months. She was a financial analyst in a department whose manager she had recently discovered was routing expense approvals through a structure that looked to her trained and careful eye very much like the structure Sandra Cho had documented in the forensic audit findings that had been shared internally 6 months earlier as part of the company's transparency initiative. Sophie had recognized the pattern because she had read the transparency report. She had read it carefully and completely, which not everyone had done, and she had recognized what she was seeing in the expense approvals because she had been given the documentation to recognize it, which was itself one of the things Rachel's transformation mandate had been designed to produce. She sat across from Rachel now, with her hands folded in her lap, and the particular expression of someone who has made a decision that frightened them and is not entirely sure yet whether it was the right one. Rachel slid the reporting form across the desk. It was a single page, clean, the language clear and protective and specific about what would happen next and what rights the person signing it was entitled to. Sophie looked at it. She looked at Rachel. "What happens if I sign this?" she said. Rachel remembered another table, another room, another document slid across a surface, a man leaning back in his chair believing he had just solved his problem, the sound of a pen on a signature line and the silence that followed it and the 3 minutes that came after. She picked up a pen and held it out. "The truth gets investigated," she said. Sophie took the pen. She signed. Rachel looked through the window of the small meeting room toward the factory floor 7 stories below, where 400 people were doing their work with the knowledge that their judgment mattered and their honesty had a place to go, and the system around them was imperfectly and incrementally, and with the daily effort of people committed to making it so worthy of their trust. She had not saved Northbridge by buying it. She had not won by defeating Grant. She had built something, piece by piece, document by document, lunch by lunch, honest conversation by honest conversation, over 8 years of being present in a building where the powerful had trained themselves not to look. And now the most important thing in that building was not the ownership structure or the executive suite or the forensic audit findings or the regulatory compliance record. It was a 26-year-old financial analyst who had read a transparency report, recognized a pattern, walked into a small room on the 7th floor, and signed her name. Because she believed someone would actually do something about it. Because someone had made that belief possible. That was the victory. Not the signature Grant had demanded on a separation agreement on a morning when he believed silence meant surrender, but the signature a young woman gave freely 1 year later in a room built specifically to receive it. Real power is not the ability to destroy the people who underestimated you. Real power is building something that still works long after you have stepped back from the center of it, something that carries forward not your name or your authority, but the principle that honest people deserve a system equal to their honesty. Rachel Whitmore had spent 8 years learning what was broken. She had spent 1 year fixing it. And what she left behind was not a monument to what she had endured. It was proof of what becomes possible when someone with power chooses deliberately and with full understanding of the alternatives to use it for something larger than themselves.